What on earth were people thinking? These are some of the most dangerous runways in the world. So, in this video, I'm counting down 10 of the scariest runways that pilots fear. Number 10, Princess Juliana, where the beach is the final approach. Maho Beach on the island of St. Martin is about 400 meters of white sand, warm water, and a chain link fence that tourists grip with both hands. Not because they're afraid of the ocean, because a Boeing 747 is about to pass directly over their heads at roughly 20 meters altitude. Close enough to feel the heat off the engines, close enough that the jet blast on departure has knocked grown adults off their feet. Princess Juliana International Airport sits at the eastern end of that beach. The runway is 2,179 meters long, which sounds adequate until you understand the geography. The approach path from the west comes in over open water, which means aircraft have to be low, very low, before they reach the threshold. There's no room to be high and correct. You're either on the slope or you're going around, and going around here means threading back through controlled airspace over a small island with mountains to the east. KLM operated Boeing 747s into St. Martin for decades. The sight of a wide-body jet descending at rooftop level became one of the most photographed aviation spectacles on Earth. The airport even posted warning signs along the perimeter fence. They read, "Danger. Jet blast of aircraft can cause physical harm and slash or death. Not a suggestion. A statement of documented fact. And that documentation matters." In 2017, a woman from New Zealand was standing behind a departing aircraft on the beach side of the fence, holding the chain link as the engine spooled up. The jet blast knocked her down. She struck her head. She was 57 years old, and she died from her injuries 2 days later. Her companion was also injured. The signs were already there. The warnings were already posted. People came anyway because the spectacle is genuinely unlike anything else in commercial aviation. A full-size airliner descending so low over a public beach that you can read the livery clearly, can count the windows, can see the landing gear lock into place. It looks wrong. It looks like something has gone badly off script. Pilots flying the approach know exactly what they're doing. The geometry is demanding, but it's managed, it's trained for, it's a known quantity. The tourists on the beach are a different matter entirely. Maho Beach still draws crowds. The fence is still there. Aircraft still cross at the same altitude they always have because the physics of the approach haven't changed and the runway hasn't moved. The airport was significantly damaged by Hurricane Irma in 2017 and rebuilt, reopening to commercial traffic in 2019. The spectators came back with it. There's something worth sitting with in that. The airport authority put up signs that say the jet blast can kill you. A woman died proving it. And the beach is still full of people holding the fence, phones raised, waiting for the next one to come in. The ocean is right there. The runway is right there. And the gap between them is where the aircraft has to be. 9, Gibraltar, where the road and the runway share the same tarmac. Twice a day, sometimes more, the traffic lights on Winston Churchill Avenue in Gibraltar turn red. Cars stop, pedestrians wait, and then a commercial aircraft taxis across the road or lands directly over it and continues to the terminal on the other side. This is not a near miss. This is the design. Gibraltar Airport sits on a narrow peninsula. The Rock of Gibraltar rises to 426 meters on one side, Spanish territory on the other, and the Mediterranean pressing in from both ends. There is almost no flat land here. When the British built the runway during the Second World War, they had exactly one option for where to put it, and Winston Churchill Avenue happened to already be there. So the runway crosses the road crosses the runway, and that arrangement has been in continuous operation ever since. The runway itself is 1,760 meters long. To put that in context, the standard minimum for a commercial jet runway is around 1,800 meters, and Gibraltar is already below it, operating on an exemption, with a rock face at one end and open water at the other. Aircraft approaching from the west come in low over the Bay of Gibraltar, line up on a runway that is visibly shorter than it should be, and touch down knowing there is no meaningful overrun area at either threshold. The sea is not a safety margin, it's just what's there. The crosswind situation makes this considerably worse. The rock creates a phenomenon called mechanical turbulence. Wind hits the cliff face, deflects unpredictably, and arrives at runway level from directions that don't match what the instruments say is happening 500 meters back on approach. Pilots flying into Gibraltar are trained specifically for this. It's not a general aviation skill. It's Gibraltar-specific knowledge built through repetition and briefing, because the rock behaves differently depending on the season, the wind speed, and the time of day. And then there's the road. Winston Churchill Avenue carries approximately 10,000 vehicles per day. Every single landing and takeoff requires the road to be closed. Barriers come down, traffic halts, and the aircraft has right of way. The closure lasts only a few minutes each time, but across a full day of operations it adds up. Locals factor it into their commutes the way other cities factor in the level crossings or drawbridges. It's infrastructure, it's managed, and it has been for the better part of 80 years. What's strange is how routine it looks from the outside. You can stand at the barrier and watch a Monarch or an EasyJet aircraft roll across the road at walking pace, wingtips clearing the lamppost by a margin that looks tighter than it probably is, and then the barriers lift and the cars just go. No ceremony, no announcement. The road resumes because the road always resumes. The approach from the east, over Spanish territory, was historically complicated by a political dispute between Britain and Spain over Gibraltar's sovereignty. For years, the Spanish border was closed entirely, which meant the only way in or out was by air or sea. The airport wasn't just convenient, it was the lifeline. That context is worth holding on to when you're watching a video of a Ryanair 737 crossing a public road on its way to the gate. It looks absurd. It is absurd in the technical sense, a solution that shouldn't exist, produced by geography that left no alternatives. The Rock of Gibraltar decided where the runway would go, and the road just had to work around it. It still does. Every day, 10,000 cars at a time. At number 8, Barra Airport, the only runway the tide controls. Twice a day, every day, the Atlantic Ocean walks onto the runway at Barra Airport and claims it, not floods it in a dramatic sense, just covers it, quietly and completely, the way the sea does when it's made up its mind. The runway disappears underwater. The airport, by any operational definition, ceases to exist. And then the tide goes out, the sand reappears, and Loganair schedules the next departure. This is not a malfunction. This is the airport. Barra Airport sits on the Cockle Strand, a broad tidal beach on the northern tip of the island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwest coast of Scotland. There are 3 runways marked on the beach, not paved, not lit with embedded lights, not surfaced with anything harder than compacted shell sand. They're marked with wooden poles. The runways exist because the beach is wide enough and flat enough to land on, and because in 1936 someone looked at that beach and decided it was the only viable option for connecting Barra to the mainland. They were right. It still is. The island has a population of around 1,100 people. The ferry crossing to the mainland takes several hours and is weather dependent in its own right. The air service operated by Loganair, currently using twin Otter aircraft which are specifically suited to short, unprepared surfaces, is not a convenience. For medical emergencies, for freight, for residents who need to move quickly, it's the link that makes island life sustainable. The airport has been operating continuously since that 1936 decision, which makes it one of the longest running scheduled beach airports in the world. Pilots flying into Barra don't just check the weather, they check the tide tables. The approach comes in from the sea, which means the aircraft is descending over open water before touching down on sand. There's no instrument landing system here, no ILS glide slope, no localizer. It's a visual approach, flown by reference to the beach itself, the poles marking the runway edges, and whatever the conditions are doing that day. The Outer Hebrides are not known for cooperative weather. Wind off the Atlantic arrives sideways, changes direction without announcement, and carries enough moisture that visibility can drop to near zero in minutes. Pilots operating the Barra service are trained specifically for these conditions. It's a route that selects for experience. The surface itself adds another layer. Compacted shell sand behaves differently from asphalt. It's firm enough to support a twin otter under normal conditions, but its load-bearing properties change with moisture content, with temperature, with how recently the tide came through. There's no maintenance crew resurfacing the runway between operations. The ocean does that, whether or not the result is ideal. And the cockle shells are real. Locals still collect them from the strand. The airport and the shellfish harvest share the same beach, which is either charming or deeply strange depending on your relationship to aviation infrastructure. What you see if you're standing on the beach watching an approach is an aircraft coming in low over gray water, dropping onto pale sand, and rolling to a stop in front of a small terminal building that looks like it belongs to a golf club. The whole thing takes about 40 seconds from touchdown to stop. Then the passengers get off. The bags come out of the nose, and the beach goes back to being a beach. Barra Airport has been named the most scenic airport in the world in multiple surveys. The pilots who fly it regularly will tell you the scenery is the least of their concerns. The tide comes back in around 6 hours. The schedule works around it, or it doesn't work at all. 7. Madeira Airport. Built on columns over the sea. When Madeira Airport was originally constructed in 1964, the runway was 1,600 meters long. That's shorter than the minimum recommended for commercial jet operations, roughly the length of 14 football pitches laid end to end. For the first decades of its existence, the airport could only be served by small propeller aircraft, which suited a Portuguese island of modest tourism traffic reasonably well. Then the jets came, and the tourists came with them, and the runway became a serious problem. The island of Madeira sits in the North Atlantic, about 970 kilometers southwest of Lisbon. It's volcanic, which means it rises steeply from the water. The terrain around the airport climbs sharply on 3 sides, and the 4th side is the ocean. There is no flat land to extend the runway into. The mountain won't give any up, and the sea is right there. So the engineers extended the runway over the sea. The solution, completed in 2003, involved constructing a platform supported by 180 concrete columns, each one rising from the water below. The platform added nearly 800 meters to the runway's usable length, bringing the total to 2,777 meters. Long enough for wide-body jets, long enough for the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737 services that now connect Madeira to mainland Europe year-round. From above, the extended section looks like the runway simply continues past the coastline and floats above the Atlantic. From below, standing on a boat looking up, you can see the columns clearly. 180 of them, carrying a runway, carrying aircraft, carrying passengers who mostly have no idea what's underneath them. The engineering won an Outstanding Structure Award from the International Association for Bridge and Structural Engineering in 2004. The columns are designed to withstand Atlantic swell, salt corrosion, and the dynamic loads of repeated aircraft landings. They've been doing that for over 20 years without incident. But the structure is only part of what makes Madeira demanding. The surrounding terrain creates a wind environment that is genuinely unpredictable. The mountains to the north channel and accelerate airflow, which then tumbles down toward the airport in patterns that change with the season and the time of day. Wind shear, the sudden change in wind speed or direction over a short distance, is a documented recurring feature of approaches here. Pilots can be established on a stable approach and encounter a significant wind shift in the final few hundred meters, right where there's no altitude left to correct with. The airport has specific crew training requirements as a result. Not every airline's pilots are automatically qualified to operate here. Madeira has to be earned. The approach from the east over the water is the standard arrival. The aircraft comes in low over the Atlantic, the extended platform visible ahead, the cliff face rising to the left. There's a displaced threshold. The point where aircraft are actually permitted to touch down is set back from the physical end of the runway to provide clearance over obstacles on approach. Every meter of that margin was calculated carefully because the margin for error on either side is genuinely small. Crosswind landings here are a particular challenge. The wind doesn't always cooperate with the runway's orientation, and the crab angles required to track the center line in a strong crosswind can be significant. Videos of crosswind landings at Madeira circulate regularly in aviation communities, not because they're accidents, but because they look alarming to anyone not familiar with the technique. The aircraft arrives sideways, straightens at the last moment, and touches down. Correct procedure. Looks wrong every time. Madeira handled over 3 million passengers in recent years. The columns hold, the platform holds, the approaches continue, in crosswinds and in calm, with the Atlantic sitting underneath the whole operation, neither helping nor hindering. It just keeps moving, the way the Atlantic does. Courchevel Altiport. Number 6, 537 meters. That's the entire runway at Courchevel Altiport in the French Alps, shorter than the length of 5 city blocks, shorter than the stopping distance of a commercial jet at normal landing speed, shorter than what most pilots would consider a runway at all. For context, the standard minimum for a basic general aviation runway is around 800 meters. Courchevel is operating at roughly 2/3 of that, and it's built into the side of a mountain. The Altiport sits at an elevation of 2,008 meters in the Trentes Valley in Savoy in the French Alps. It serves the Courchevel Ski Resort, one of the most expensive ski destinations in the world, drawing the kind of clientele who arrive by private jet rather than transfer bus. The runway was constructed in the 1960s specifically to connect the resort to the outside world by air, because the road access at the time was limited and the demand from wealthy visitors was not. What makes Courchevel genuinely different from every other short runway on this list is the gradient. The runway slopes uphill at 18.5%, not flat with a slight incline, visibly steeply uphill, steep enough that standing at the lower threshold and looking toward the upper end, the far end of the runway disappears from view. Aircraft land uphill, which uses the slope itself as a braking aid. They depart downhill, which uses the slope as an acceleration ramp. At the lower end of the runway, there is no flat ground. There is no overrun area. There is a drop, a cliff edge falling away into the valley below. The departure procedure is the part that gets pilots' attention. The aircraft rolls downhill, accelerating, and at the threshold it either has flying speed or it doesn't. If it does, it pitches up and climbs away from the valley. If it doesn't, and there's no runway left to find more speed on, the options narrow very quickly. There is no abort point beyond a certain distance. Commitment is not optional. The mountain made sure of that. Approaches are equally unforgiving. Pilots come in over the valley, tracking uphill toward the threshold, managing a descent rate that has to account for the rising terrain, while simultaneously setting up for a runway that is both short and sloped. The approach angle is steep by any standard, steeper than a normal 3-degree glide slope, because the terrain demands it. Aircraft appear to be diving at the mountainside until the last few seconds, when the runway resolves itself and the picture makes sense. From the ground, watching an approach at Courchevel, it looks for a long moment like the aircraft has miscalculated. Not every pilot is permitted to fly here. Courchevel requires a specific mountain flying qualification, a rating issued only after dedicated training in alpine operations, including short field techniques, terrain awareness, and the particular wind behavior that develops in enclosed valleys. The French Civil Aviation Authority does not allow general instrument ratings to substitute for this. You either have the mountain qualification or you don't operate here. Full stop. The wind in the valley is its own variable. Thermal activity during sunny afternoons creates updrafts and downdrafts that don't appear on any chart and don't announce themselves on approach. Experienced Courchevel pilots fly early in the morning when the air is more stable, and the most cautious operators avoid afternoon slots during high summer entirely. The mountain generates its own weather on its own schedule, and the schedule doesn't account for bookings. But yeah, it's a ski resort, so the aircraft that use it are almost exclusively private jets and turboprops serving passengers who want to be on the slopes by noon. The runway sees Pilatus PC-12s, Cessna Caravans, and small business jets operated by crews who've trained specifically for this environment. It is a niche operation by design, serving a niche clientele, on a runway that a niche group of pilots are qualified to use. The approach at Courchevel has been used in a James Bond film. The producers chose it because it looks genuinely implausible. The pilots who fly it regularly would tell you that's about right. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. And we're only halfway through, the runways still ahead make Courchevel look straightforward. Barra Airport, Bhutan. Number 5. In the entire Kingdom of Bhutan, there is one airport that handles international flights. One runway. One approach corridor threading through a valley in the Himalayas, flanked by peaks that rise to over 5,500 meters on either side, taller than anything in the Alps, taller than anything in the Rockies, tall enough that the aircraft flying the approach is surrounded by terrain that dwarfs it completely. That airport is Paro, and as of the most recent available figures, fewer than 30 pilots in the world are certified to land there. Not 30 airlines, 30 individual pilots. Paro sits at an elevation of 2,235 meters in the Paro Valley, about 6 kilometers from the town of Paro in western Bhutan. The runway is 1,964 meters long, workable for the Airbus A319 and ATR turboprops that serve the airport, but with essentially no tolerance for deviation given the terrain on all sides. The valley is narrow. The river runs alongside the runway. The mountains begin immediately beyond the airport boundary and climb steeply in every direction. The approach procedure is what separates Paro from almost every other airport on Earth. There is no instrument landing system, there is no radar approach. Pilots fly what is called a visual approach, meaning they navigate by sight, using the terrain itself as reference, following a specific curved path through the valley that was developed through direct observation of what the aircraft needs to do to arrive safely. The procedure involves a sharp turn at low altitude, timed by reference to landmarks on the ground, with the aircraft banking steeply to align with the runway in the final moments of the approach. It has to be flown in daylight. Full stop. Night operations at Paro are not permitted, because the approach depends on seeing the valley, seeing the peaks, seeing the river. Remove the visibility and the procedure becomes unexecutable. Cloud cover below a certain ceiling closes the airport entirely. There is no instrument backup. When Paro closes, it closes, and passengers wait. The certification process for Paro reflects exactly how seriously Bhutan's a civil aviation authority treats this. Pilots must complete a specific number of supervised approaches with an examiner before they're permitted to operate independently. The qualification is route specific. It doesn't transfer to other challenging airports, and it doesn't come from a simulator. It comes from flying the actual approach, in the actual valley, under supervision, until the examiner is satisfied. Drak Air, Bhutan's national carrier, and a small number of other approved operators are the only airlines permitted to serve the airport. The list does not grow quickly. The surrounding peaks create wind behavior that is layered and complex. Katabatic flows, cold air draining down the mountain slopes, arrive at valley level in patterns that vary with the time of day and the season. Morning approaches are generally more stable. Afternoon flying carries higher risk of turbulence and wind shear as the terrain heats unevenly. Pilots flying Paro regularly develop a detailed mental model of how the valley behaves across different conditions, and they use that model on every approach. It's not procedural knowledge. It's accumulated, specific, personal knowledge of one particular place. The Kingdom of Bhutan limits tourist arrivals by policy, a deliberate strategy to manage the environmental and cultural impact of tourism. For years, visitors paid a daily tariff that made Bhutan one of the more expensive destinations in Asia to enter legally. The airport reflects that philosophy. Paro is not built for volume. It's built for access, minimal and controlled, to a country that has decided exactly how much of the outside world it wants to let in. The aircraft that land there, and the pilots who bring them in, are operating at the edge of what scheduled commercial aviation is designed to do. The valley is beautiful. That's not the point. The point is that the mountains on either side of the approach corridor are not decorative. They are the constraint that every pilot at the controls of a Paro-bound aircraft is managing, from the moment the valley comes into view until the wheels are on the ground. After that, Bhutan is on the other side of the door. But getting through the door is the part that took 30 pilots to master. 4 Narsarsuaq, where the glacier writes the weather forecast. In 1941, the United States Army needed a refueling stop between North America and Europe. The North Atlantic crossing was pushing the range limits of military aircraft, and a waypoint was required, somewhere with flat ground, access to fuel, and enough distance from the fighting to be relatively secure. They found a strip of flat land at the head of a fjord in southern Greenland, surrounded by glaciers, hemmed in by mountains, and accessible only by sea or air. They built a runway there in months. That runway is still in use. It's called Narsarsuaq Airport. The fjord approach to Narsarsuaq is one of the most visually striking in commercial aviation, and one of the most technically demanding. Aircraft arriving from Europe descend into the Tunuljarvik Fjord, a narrow channel of dark water flanked by rock walls and glacial ice, flying at low altitude between terrain that rises sharply on either side. The fjord is approximately 40 kilometers long. Pilots navigate it at low level, following the water, tracking the curves, managing an approach that has no instrument guidance for much of its length because the terrain blocks the signals. It's visual flying in a place where the weather can change in minutes, and the weather here changes in minutes. Katabatic winds are the primary hazard. Cold, dense air accumulates on the Greenland ice sheet, one of the largest bodies of ice on Earth, covering roughly 1.7 million square kilometers, an area larger than Mexico. And when conditions allow, that air drains off the ice sheet and accelerates down through the valleys toward the coast. The wind arrives fast, cold, and without much warning. At Narsarsuaq, katabatic events can produce sudden, severe wind shear on approach, the kind that changes airspeed by 30 or 40 knots in a matter of seconds, right when the aircraft is low and slow and committed to landing. Pilots who fly the route regularly treat the forecast as a starting point, not a guarantee. The runway itself is 1,830 meters long, oriented to match the fjord, which means crosswind options are limited by geography. You land in the direction the fjord runs, because the fjord is what brought you in. There is no instrument landing system. Approaches are non-precision, flown with reference to GPS and visual cues, with a missed approach procedure that requires climbing steeply to clear the terrain on either side of the fjord before the aircraft can safely maneuver. If the approach goes wrong late, the recovery is not straightforward. The airport serves a small community. Narsarsuaq itself has only a few dozen permanent residents, with the broader Kujalleq municipality numbering in the low thousands. But it's also the primary gateway for expeditions heading to the southern Greenland ice sheet, for researchers, and for the summer tourist season, which brings visitors to see the fjords, the Norse ruins at nearby Kasiarsuk, and the glaciers that calve directly into the water a short distance from the airport. Air Greenland operates the route using Dash 8 turboprops for regional connections and coordinating with transatlantic services that still use Narsarsuaq as a technical stop. The wartime infrastructure is still visible. The original American base, called Bluey West 1 during the war, left behind buildings, fuel storage, and the bones of an airfield that was never designed for permanence but has outlasted the conflict by 8 decades. Some of the original structures still stand near the terminal. The runway has been resurfaced and extended from its wartime configuration, but the orientation and location are unchanged from 1941. The Army picked the only viable spot, and it's still the only viable spot. Volcanic ash is an additional periodic complication. Narsarsuaq sits within range of Icelandic volcanic systems, and eruptions that inject ash into the upper atmosphere can close the airport for days at a time when the ash cloud drifts in the right direction. The 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull disrupted European aviation broadly, but airports in Greenland and the North Atlantic face their own specific closures based on ash concentration forecasts. Narsarsuaq has no alternative. When ash closes it, the community waits. The glacier at the end of the fjord calves icebergs into the water year-round. Some of them drift past the airport threshold on their way to the open sea. Pilots on approach watch them go by below. The Army built this place in a matter of months, in wartime, in Greenland. It has been operating ever since, and nothing about the fjord has gotten any wider. At number 3, Madikane Airstrip, where the runway ends in open air. On the Maludi Mountains Plateau in the Highland Kingdom of Lesotho, there is an airstrip that ends in nothing. Not a fence, not an overrun area, not a gravel bed designed to slow a departing aircraft that run out of ideas, just the edge of a cliff, dropping approximately 600 meters into the valley below, roughly the height of 2 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other, and then the valley floor. The strip is 460 meters long. That's it. 460 meters from one end to the other, on a plateau with a cliff at the departure end and rising terrain at the arrival end. For reference, the absolute minimum runway length for a light single-engine aircraft under ideal conditions is generally considered to be around 300 meters. Madacane is not much beyond that, and the conditions here are never ideal. Lesotho is the only country in the world whose entire territory sits above 1,000 meters elevation. The capital, Maseru, sits at around 1,500 meters. Madacane is higher still, on a plateau in the Maludi Range, and the altitude matters enormously for aviation. Thinner air at altitude means engines produce less power and wings generate less lift. The same aircraft that lifts off comfortably at sea level needs significantly more runway at altitude to reach the same flying speed. At Madacane, the aircraft needs more runway than it has. The cliff at the end is not a hazard to be avoided, it's part of the procedure. On takeoff, the aircraft accelerates down the strip, reaches the edge, and drops into the valley. The descent gives it the additional airspeed it needs to establish a climb. It's not a malfunction, it's the only way it works. Pilots who operate here know exactly what's going to happen. The plateau ends, the aircraft falls briefly, and then the wings take over. But there is a specific point on the runway beyond which a rejected takeoff is no longer survivable. Commit too late, and the cliff is simply what happens next. The approach from the valley side involves climbing to plateau elevation and then descending steeply onto a very short strip with rising ground ahead. There is no instrument approach, there is no radar. Visibility and local knowledge are the tools available. And local knowledge means knowing this specific plateau, this specific strip, in this specific set of conditions. Pilots operating into Madacane are typically flying light aircraft, Cessnas, Pipers, small turboprops, and they're typically doing it in service of the communities in the highlands that have no road access to speak of. Because that's the thing about Madacane. It's not a tourist destination, it's not a ski resort for wealthy visitors. It's a medical and aid access point for communities in one of the most rugged and isolated highland environments in southern Africa. Lesotho has a significant HIV/AIDS burden, limited road infrastructure in the highlands, in communities that are genuinely cut off from medical services without air access. The pilots who fly into strips like Madacane are doing it because the alternative for the people on the ground is no access at all. The aircraft that serve these strips are operated by organizations including the Flying Mission and similar faith-based and humanitarian aviation groups that have been working in southern Africa for decades. Their pilots are specifically trained for highland strip operations, short field technique, density altitude calculation, terrain awareness, and they fly these approaches regularly enough to maintain currency. It is skilled, essential, unglamorous work. The plateau surface at Madacane is grass and compacted earth, which changes with the season. Wet conditions after rain make the surface softer and reduce braking effectiveness. On a 460-meter strip with a cliff at one end, reduced braking effectiveness is not an abstract concern. Pilots check the surface condition before committing to a landing, and they make the call on the day based on what they find. There is no control tower to ask. There is no ATI's broadcast giving current conditions. There is the strip, the surface, the wind, and the pilot's judgment. 600 meters of air below the departure threshold. 460 meters of runway above it. Every takeoff from Madacane is a decision made in full knowledge of what the cliff means, and a commitment to the calculation being right. 2. Tenzing Hillary Airport, Lukla. The approach before the approach. Every climber who has ever stood on the summit of Everest almost certainly passed through Lukla first. Not through Kathmandu, not through base camp, through Lukla specifically because Lukla is the gateway. The trailhead for the Everest base camp route begins here. The Sherpa communities of the Khumbu Valley depend on it. The trekking economy of the entire region flows through a single runway, 527 meters long, cut into the side of a Himalayan ridge at 2,860 meters above sea level. This entry covers the approach, the airport, and what the record shows. The next entry covers what all of that means when it goes wrong. The runway at Tenzing Hillary Airport slopes uphill at approximately 12%. Not as steep as Courchevel, but at nearly 3 times the altitude, where the air is thin enough that engines and wings are both working harder just to maintain what would be routine performance at sea level. The uphill gradient assists braking on landing. On departure, aircraft roll downhill and launch from the lower threshold, which drops away into a valley falling several hundred meters almost immediately beyond the runway end. Same basic principle as Matacane, considerably more traffic. The approach from the south brings aircraft up the Dude Koshi River Valley, threading between ridgelines, climbing toward a runway that is set into the terrain at an angle that makes it essentially invisible until the final turn. There is no instrument approach procedure, no ILS, no radar. Visibility is the only tool available, which means cloud cover, common in the Himalayas, especially during the monsoon season from June through September, can close the airport for days at a stretch with no warning and no reliable forecast of when it will reopen. Aircraft that launch from Kathmandu for Lukla sometimes turn back. Sometimes they wait in a holding pattern. Sometimes the cloud lifts and sometimes it doesn't. The missed approach at Lukla is the detail that concentrates the mind. If a pilot is on approach and decides the landing isn't going to work, too high, too fast, visibility dropping, surface condition uncertain, the go-around requires an immediate climbing turn to avoid the terrain rising directly ahead beyond the runway. There is no flat, open airspace to climb into. The mountains are there, on the other side of the threshold, and the turn has to happen quickly and correctly. Pilots flying Lukla are trained for this specific scenario. The go-around is not a relaxed maneuver. It's a committed, precise escape from a very small box of available airspace. The aircraft that serve Lukla are twin Otters and small turboprops operated by Nepali carriers, Tara, Air, Summit Air, and others. They fly the route multiple times daily during the trekking seasons, which run roughly from March through May and from October through November. During peak season, the airport is as busy as its infrastructure can handle, with aircraft stacking up in Kathmandu waiting for weather windows, then launching in sequence when Lukla reports clear. The turnaround time on the ground is short. The crews are experienced. The schedule is aggressive because the weather windows are finite. The elevation compounds every challenge. At 2,860 meters, the air density is roughly 73% of what it is at sea level. Engines produce less thrust. Wings generate less lift. The aircraft needs more speed to fly and more runway to reach that speed, and more distance to stop, all of which is in direct tension with a runway that is 527 meters long. Pilots calculate density altitude before every departure and adjust their weight limits accordingly. On hot days, passenger loads are reduced. Freight gets left behind. The physics of thin air are non-negotiable. There have been serious accidents at Lukla. In 2008, a Yeti Airlines twin Otter on approach in poor visibility struck terrain short of the runway, killing all 18 people on board, 15 passengers and 3 crew. It remains one of the deadliest accidents in the airport's history. In 2019, a Summit Air twin Otter collided on the ground with a helicopter during landing, killing 3 people. The airport's accident record across its operational history reflects the consistent, compounding difficulty of the environment. Altitude, terrain, weather, short runway, no instrument approaches, high traffic volume during peak seasons. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay summited Everest in 1953. The airport that now carries both their names was built in 1964, constructed in part with Hillary's involvement to improve access for the Sherpa communities he had worked with. For 60 years, it has been the door to the highest mountains on Earth. The next entry is about what happens when that door does open cleanly, the most dangerous airport in the world. Number 1. The previous entry described the approach, the runway, the altitude, the physics. This entry is about what Tenzing-Hillary Airport actually is, not as an engineering problem, but as a place that has been making and breaking the plans of pilots, climbers, trekkers, and Sherpa communities for 60 years, and about what it costs when the mountain decides it isn't done yet. Lukla sits at the junction of two realities. On one side, it's the busiest small airport in Nepal, handling thousands of flights per year during the trekking seasons, connecting the Khumbu Valley to Kathmandu in a 20-minute flight that would otherwise be a 7-day walk. On the other side, it's a 527-meter strip of asphalt on a Himalayan ridge, surrounded by terrain that has no interest in the schedules of the aircraft trying to use it. Both of these things are true simultaneously, every single operating day. The record of accidents at Lukla is not a list of flukes, it's a pattern. In 1973, a Royal Nepal Airlines flight crashed on approach, killing one person. In 1984, another crash on approach. In 2004, a Cosmic Air Twin Otter overran the runway on landing and fell into the valley below, killing all 5 people on board. In 2008, the Yeti Airlines accident, described in the previous entry, killed 18. In 2010, a Agni air crash killed 14 people. These are not isolated incidents spread across decades of otherwise clean operations. They are recurring events at the same airport, on the same approach, in the same mountain environment, across different carriers and different aircraft types and different crews. The common thread is not pilot error, not mechanical failure, not any single cause. It's the environment. Lukla is the kind of place that finds the gap in whatever you bring to it. Weather is the primary variable. The Khumbu Valley generates its own microclimate. Cloud forms quickly, visibility drops without the gradual warning you might get at a lower elevation airport, and the gap between flyable and unflyable conditions can close in the time it takes to fly the approach. Pilots launching from Kathmandu check the Lukla weather report, but the report reflects conditions at the time of the observation, not the time of arrival. 20 minutes is enough for everything to change. Crews have turned back from Lukla in conditions that were reported as clear at departure. They've also pressed on in conditions that looked marginal and found the runway waiting. The mountain doesn't telegraph its intentions. The Sherpa communities of the Khumbu Valley, Namche Bazaar, Phakding, Monjo, the villages along the trail to base camp, depend on Lukla for medical evacuations, for supply of goods that can't be carried in by porter, for the movement of people who need to get out quickly. When the airport closes for weather, those communities are isolated in a way that has direct consequences. A medical emergency during a closure means a helicopter if one can fly, or nothing if one can't. The airport's operational status is not an abstract aviation matter. It's a lifeline question. The aircraft operating into Lukla are predominantly twin otters and small turboprops, de Havilland Canada DHC-6, LET, L410 turbolets, flown by Nepali carriers whose crews accumulate enormous experience on this specific route. Some pilots have flown the Lukla approach hundreds of times. They know the valley, know the typical wind patterns, know the visual cues that tell them the approach is tracking correctly. That experience is real, and it matters. It is also not a guarantee, because the mountain has taken experienced crews before and will again. The name of the airport carries weight that deserves acknowledging. Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa mountaineer who reached the summit of Everest alongside Edmund Hillary in 1953, was from the Khumbu region. Hillary was instrumental in developing infrastructure for the Sherpa communities after the climb, including the original construction of the Lukla airstrip in 1964. The airport was renamed in their honor in 2008, the same year as the deadliest accident in its history. That timing is not a comment on anything. It's just what happened. Every climber who has summited Everest in the era of commercial trekking has almost certainly sat in a small turboprop on a short runway at altitude, waiting for the go signal, watching the clouds, trusting the crew. The mountain is visible from the airport on clear days, not close, not looming, but present. A white shape at the edge of the sky, at 8,849 meters, which is roughly 4 times the elevation of where the aircraft is sitting on the runway. The pilots who fly Lukla do it because the valley needs them to. They fly it in good weather and marginal weather, in peak season and off-season, with full loads and reduced ones. They calculate the density altitude, check the surface, brief the go-around, and commit. And then the mountain decides. It always has. It still does. Every morning the weather lifts, and the first aircraft of the day turns onto the runway and holds for a moment before the power comes up. The mountain decides who gets in, and the mountain decides when.